The phone line out of Pilsen was bad that night, and General George S. Patton was shouting into it anyway. It was the first week of May, 1945. Germany was finished. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead in a bunker, and everyone with a radio in Europe knew it. Third Army Headquarters was running out of a requisitioned building on the western edge of a city his tanks had taken that same afternoon, almost without firing a shot, maps still being pinned to the walls, staff officers moving fast because the front kept dissolving faster than anyone could chart it, and 50 miles east of where Patton was standing, a city was tearing itself apart, and nobody was coming to help it. A three-man scouting team he'd sent forward that morning had just come back through the door with dust on their boots and a report he did not like. He read it standing up, then he picked up the field telephone to call General Omar Bradley for the second time that day, to ask for something he had already been told. Once, that morning, he could not have. What he said into that phone, word for word, is in the record. 5 words that sounded less like a request and more like a warning. "I'll call you tomorrow from Prague." What came back down that line in response is the piece of this story that gets flattened every time it's told as a fight between two men. It wasn't a fight between two men. It was bigger than that, colder than that, and Patton knew it the moment he hung up the phone. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second, because to understand what "I'll call you tomorrow from Prague" actually cost to say, you need to understand where the Third Army was standing and why nobody wanted it to move another inch. By the first days of May 1945, Czechoslovakia was the last capital city in Europe still sitting under German occupation. Berlin was rubble. Vienna had fallen in April. Every other major city on the continent had already changed hands. Prague had not. German garrison troops still patrolled its streets. The Gestapo was still operating, and Patton's Third Army, sweeping across Bavaria with almost nothing left in front of it, had a clear road east. The distance between where his tanks sat and the outskirts of Prague was roughly 50 miles. 50 miles of open country against a German Seventh Army that was already collapsing in place, surrendering by the division. Patton could have been in Prague inside of a day. He knew it, his staff knew it, and it did not matter because the map that decided who liberated Prague had already been drawn, and it had not been drawn by soldiers. It had been drawn months earlier in conference rooms, between men deciding how post-war Europe would be divided before the war had even finished being fought. Czechoslovakia sat on the Soviet side of that line. A demarcation had been agreed running roughly from Karlovy Vary through Pilsen to Český Budějovice, and the understanding, worked out at the highest levels between Washington, London, and Moscow, was simple. American troops did not cross it. The Red Army, moving in from the east under Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front, would be the one to take the capital. That was the agreement on paper. The roots of that agreement went back to February, to Yalta, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had sat down and carved zones of occupation across a Germany that hadn't even surrendered yet, and where Stalin had also promised something Washington badly wanted, that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's collapse. That promise mattered more in Washington than any single Czech city did. Keeping Moscow cooperative in the war's final weeks was, to the men making these decisions from a distance, worth more than the 50 miles between Pilsen and Prague. What happened on the ground in the first days of May was going to test whether paper meant anything at all. Now, here's the thing you need to know about George Patton before this story can make any sense. This was not a man with a track record of standing still when he thought the mission demanded otherwise. Across France in the summer of 1944, Patton had a documented habit of interpreting his orders about as loosely as the paperwork would allow, pushing columns forward on fuel he technically hadn't been allocated yet, crossing rivers before the engineers had finished the bridges, moving first and squaring the paperwork with headquarters after the fact. His superiors tolerated it because it worked. At Trier in early March, he'd taken the city with 2 divisions after being told by higher headquarters that it would need at least 4, then sent back a message that read, in essence, that he had captured the objective and would now await further instructions on whether to give it back. It was, by that point in the war, simply understood that if you told Patton to advance to a certain line, there was a real chance he'd advance past it and explain himself later. That reputation is exactly why what happened in the first week of May is so easy to get wrong when people tell this story. Everyone who knew Patton's history in the summer of 1944 would have bet that when Prague started broadcasting for help, he was going to move. The story practically writes itself that way. a defiant general, an international boundary, a besieged city calling his name. Except that's not what happened, and the reason it didn't happen is the actual story here. Stay with me, because this is where the timeline matters. On May 4th, Patton finally got the green light he'd been asking for, permission to push his army as far as Pilsen itself, and within the hour the Third Army rolled forward and took the city almost without a fight. The next morning, May 5th, Prague exploded. Czech resistance fighters seized the radio transmitters in the city and put out an open broadcast begging anyone listening for help. "The SS are murdering Czech people here. Come and help us." Patton heard it. So did Eisenhower. So did Konev. The broadcast reached every headquarters in the theater within the hour. Patton picked up the phone to Bradley immediately and asked again for permission to move on the capital. He was told no, not yet. Hold at Pilsen. He didn't accept that as final. He sent a three-man jeep team east into the chaos to see the situation with their own eyes, past the barricades and the street fighting, into a city that by then had over 1,600 barricades going up block by block. They came back and reported what they'd seen. Patton took that report straight back to Bradley and Eisenhower and made his case one more time, and that's when he said it. "I'll call you tomorrow from Prague." It wasn't a question. It was Patton telling his own chain of command, as plainly as he knew how, that if somebody didn't stop him, he was going to go. If you're waiting for me to tell you that somebody stopped him, a Soviet marshal, on a phone line, a face-to-face standoff at the border, that's not what the record shows. And I'd be lying to you if I dressed it up that way. What actually happened is stranger and, honestly, says more about how this war ended than a shouting match ever could. Patton didn't get overruled by Konev. He got overruled by his own side, and the reason his own side said no traces straight back to Moscow. General Alexei Antonov, chief of the Soviet General Staff, had already made it plain to Eisenhower's headquarters that an American advance into the Soviet zone of operations, however well-intentioned, risked exactly the kind of accident neither side could afford with the war 1 week from officially over. Two massive mechanized armies converging on the same city from opposite directions, with the front lines blurred by a fast collapsing German defense, was a recipe for American and Soviet units shooting at each other in the dark and confused smoke of urban combat. Eisenhower had already leaned on precedent to make his decision easier. Weeks earlier, the Red Army had halted its own advance east of Wismar on the Baltic at Montgomery's request, so the Allies could secure the port without a friction point. Eisenhower expected the same courtesy to run in the other direction now, and he was not going to be the one who broke it. So when Patton's request came up the chain a second time, it went nowhere. Bradley told him again, "Hold at Pilsen." And 30 seconds later, 30 seconds after 5 words that sounded like a threat to reroute the entire post-war order of Europe by force of will, George S. Patton did the one thing almost nobody who knew him expected. He held C. What most folks don't realize is that Konev's side of that line was every bit as locked down as Patton's. This wasn't restraint on one side and free rein on the other. Days later, when Bradley floated the idea of American units pushing a little further to help finish clearing pockets of German resistance nearer the demarcation, Konev turned the offer down flat because accepting it meant violating the same line his own government had drawn. 2 armies, 2 commanders, each capable of moving fast and hard, both told by the political leadership above them to stop exactly where they stood and not 1 meter further, for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with what the map of Europe was going to look like in 10 years. Patton wasn't defied by an individual. He was boxed in by a decision that had already been made an ocean away, by men who had never seen Pilsen and never would, and there was no marshal to argue with, because the marshal on the other side of that line had gotten the identical order from his own capital. What that restraint cost is the part of this story that doesn't get told nearly enough. While the phone lines between Pilsen and Eisenhower's headquarters carried nothing but the same answer over and over, Prague kept fighting alone. A Scottish prisoner of war named William Grieg, who had escaped German custody and stumbled into the middle of the uprising, sat down at a live microphone with combat audible in the background and broadcast an open plea to the Allies for tanks, for aircraft, for anything. The first time he asked, nothing came. German reinforcements, SS troops rushed in on Field Marshal Schörner's orders, retook the radio station by force, and Czech engineers had to scramble the broadcast to a second location just to keep the appeals going out. Later, when Grieg went back on the air a second time to beg for an airstrike against a German armored column bearing down on the city, that request was actually granted, and Allied aircraft broke the column up before it reached the barricades. It's the one place in this whole story where the Allies actually reached across the line, close air support instead of ground troops, help measured out in the smallest dose that wouldn't put American boots inside the Soviet zone. On the ground, the help that mattered most didn't come from Konev at all. It came from men who, on paper, were fighting for the other side, a division of the so-called Russian Liberation Army, former Red Army soldiers, who had gone over to the Germans under General Andrei Vlasov, hoping to eventually surrender to the Americans, switched sides again in the middle of the uprising and threw themselves into the fighting alongside the Czechs, holding a hillside against an SS relief column that would otherwise have reached the city center. It is one of the stranger footnotes of the entire war that some of the soldiers who did the most to save Prague on the ground were men fighting under a flag that both Berlin and Moscow would have called traitors. Most of them never got credit for it. Barricades held through days of close fighting in city streets that had not seen combat like this in a century. By the time it was over, somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 Czech civilians and resistance fighters were dead. The German garrison commander, a man named Rudolf Toussaint, surrendered under a Czech negotiated truce on the 8th of May, walked out of the surrender talks, and said one line that summed up what 4 days of fighting had done to him. "I am now a general without an army." Konev's tanks didn't reach the city until the 9th, a full day after Prague had already fought its own way to freedom without them, and yet it was the Red Army that got the parade, the Red Army that got the date on the calendar still called Liberation Day in some histories, for arriving after the fighting was already finished. The Russians who'd actually held that hillside were gone within days, marching southwest, hoping to reach American lines before Soviet units caught up with them. Most who didn't make it in time ended up in Soviet custody. Many of them did not survive what came after. Patton's forces never crossed that line. Not on the 5th, not on the 6th, not after. He sat at Pilsen while a city 50 miles away burned block by block, entirely capable of reaching it and entirely forbidden to try. He was furious about it for the rest of his life, and he said so more than once, that the political calculation had cost lives that didn't need to be spent, that a line drawn in a conference room had decided who lived, and who didn't in the streets of a city his own tanks could have reached before dinner. Within 3 years, the government the Allies had hoped would take root in liberated Czechoslovakia was gone, replaced by a communist regime installed with Soviet backing, the exact outcome Patton had spent the final months of the war warning anyone who'd listen was coming if the West kept trading ground for good manners. Was Eisenhower right to hold the line at Pilsen, to trust that a demarcation agreed on paper mattered more than a besieged capital 50 miles away? Some would say yes, without hesitation, that avoiding a firefight between American and Soviet troops with the war 1 week from over was worth almost any cost, that a single miscalculated skirmish in those final days could have reopened a war nobody had the stomach to keep fighting. Others would say that Prague paid for that caution in bodies, that a general who was 50 miles out and fully capable of reaching the city in hours was held back by a line on a map drawn by men who never had to watch the barricades fall, and that whatever the political logic, the people calling for help over that radio broadcast never got an answer. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.